YNA is a podcast that focuses on mental health and other aspects relating to what goes on inside of a person's head. We are by no means professionals in this field and only aim to make these conversations about mental health easier for the listener. Nothing we say or talk about is professional advice unless explicitly mentioned. If you seek professional advice or experience symptoms of an actual mental disorder, please contact a professional or visit your closest center for behavioral health. You are not alone.
What's up, guys? Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you're looking for more of our content and merch information, be sure to check us out at ynamentalhealth.org. Keep an eye out for our skits and upcoming episode information. Feel free to reach out to us on IG. Our DMs are always open. And please remember, you're not alone.
Hey guys, welcome back to YNA Mental Health. My name is Sina Balouch. I'm the host of YNA Mental Health. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about projection. And projection is one of those words that people use all the time. But I think a lot of people use it without understanding it and really slowing down enough to figure out what it actually means. Because projection is not just accusing someone of something. It's not just conflict. It's not just defensiveness. And it's not just trauma. Projection is what can happen when something in us feels too painful, too shameful, too threatening, and too uncomfortable to face directly. So instead of owning it, we experience it as if it belongs to someone else. And that is why projection can shape so much. It can affect our relationships, it can affect our identity, it can affect conflict, and it can affect our self-esteem. And sometimes it can even affect the way people understand reality. One of the strongest lines from my research is, projection often reveals what we have not faced in ourselves. And honestly, that is the core of this whole episode. So today, I want to talk about what projection is, why people do it, what it feels like to project, what it feels like to be projected onto, how it affects relationships and identity, and how to tell the difference between projection and intuition. Let's dive in. So, what is projection? The clearest definition I found is that projection is when someone attributes their own feelings, traits, impulses, or insecurities to someone else. So instead of saying, I feel ashamed, or I feel angry, or I feel insecure, the mind shifts feelings outward. And it suddenly becomes, you're the angry one. You're the insecure one. You're the problem. In my research, projection is also described as the mental process by which people attribute to others what is in their own minds. It is framed as a defense mechanism where feelings, impulses, or responsibilities get assigned outward instead. And one thing that really stood out to me is that projection is usually not fully conscious. A lot of the time, it's unconscious. It is the mind trying to avoid something that it does not want to hold directly. That is one reason why projection feels so believable to the person doing it. To them, it's not just distorted reality. It's what they're seeing. It may just feel true to them. Freud captured this in one of the most clearest formulas on projection. I hate him because he hates me. In other words, something internal gets experienced as if it's coming from outside. So why do people project? This is the part that feels sad to me, because when I looked into this, what kept coming up was that people usually project when something inside them feels too difficult to acknowledge. Usually there's something painful underneath it all. It could be shame, fear, insecurity, jealousy, anger, or some part of themselves that they're not ready to face. So instead of turning inward, they push outward. One thing I found in my research is that projection helps preserve self-esteem by making difficult emotions more tolerable, because it's easier to call someone out on something else than to ask whether it's bothering us or if it's something that we have unresolved within ourselves. It's easier to say, they're the selfish one, they're the problem, than to pause and ask, what feels threatened to me right now? It's easier to say, they always find a way to react, or they always need attention. It's harder to say, what part of me feels unseen? So projection is protective, but it's a form of projection that creates distance from ourselves. It may soothe the ego for a moment, but it also leaves the deeper issue untouched. So what does it feel like to project? One of the most useful parts of my research is that it gave language to the emotional experience. Projection can feel like a sudden wave of blame, judgment, or righteous anger towards someone else, while the harder truth underneath stays out of view. And what stood out to me in this is projection often feels convincing. It can feel like certainty. It can feel like clarity. It can feel like the other person is obviously the problem. That is why it can be so hard to catch yourself in it, because it does not usually feel like avoidance. It often feels like insight. But sometimes what feels like insight is actually discomfort. It's looking for a target. Sometimes what feels like certainty is just unresolved pain that keeps being pushed outward to others, and projection gives that pain somewhere to land. Another line that really helps here comes from Freud. He wrote that internal feelings can get replaced by external perceptions. That phrase explains how projection can feel real, because the mind is experiencing something inner as if it was outside. So what does it feel like to be projected onto? Being projected onto can feel confusing. It can feel heavy. It can feel unfair. It can feel like someone's reacting to a version of you that does not match who you actually are. One of the strongest ideas I found is that if you are grounded in yourself, aware of your own emotions, and you genuinely do not recognize yourself and what another person is accusing you of, that could be a sign that you're being projected onto. Sometimes you can sense that what they're reacting to has more to do with their own past, their own wounds, their own shame, than their unresolved story than with you. But even when you know that it can still affect you, you may start over-explaining. You may start defending yourself more than usual. You may start doubting your own read on who you are. And over time, that is exhausting. So why is projection so tied to shame, insecurity, fear, and self-protection? Because projection works as a defense mechanism. That is what projection is. It's a defense mechanism to protect you. That is one of the clearest lines in my research. When a feeling is too painful, threatening, or embarrassing to face directly, the mind decides that it needs to protect you by placing that feeling that you have somewhere else. Instead of owning the insecurity, shame, or fear, the person experiences it as if it belongs to someone else. That is why projection and shame are so linked together. Shame says, I cannot bear this being true about me, while projection answers and says, then I'll have to experience the truth within me. Fear says, I don't want to feel this. Projection says, then I will find it outside myself. So projection is not random. It's often a survival strategy for feelings the person does not yet know how to tolerate. But what gets pushed away internally does not disappear. It may simply just change locations. But how do we know if I'm sensing something real or if I'm just projecting? That is such an important question because people confuse projection with intuition all the time. The distinction I found in my research is that intuition usually feels grounded, quiet, and observant, while projection usually feels charged, urgent, and personal. Intuition notices what is there, while projection reacts to what it fears, denies, or it cannot yet own. So projection usually comes with heat, more urgency, more defensiveness, and more emotional force, more need to make the other person the source of the discomfort. Another thing that I found is that projection may be at play when your reaction feels bigger than the moment calls for, or when you keep blaming people for the same thing across different relationships, or when the same wound keeps getting activated and then defended. A good question to ask is this really about what is happening right now? Or is this bringing something else unresolved in me? When it comes to projection, if the person on the other side continues to hear the criticism over and over again, this is where projection can become so damaging. It becomes a repeated projection that can alter someone's inner world. One thing I found is that hearing projected criticism over and over and over again can create emotional exhaustion, self-doubt, anxiety, and confusion. It gives them a distorted sense of reality. It can make someone hypervigilant, constantly defending themselves, or eventually starting to believe the false accusations that are being placed on them, because projection is not harmless. Just because it's unconscious doesn't mean that it can't hurt the people around you. If someone keeps hearing, "You're selfish, you're the problem, you are impossible, you are lazy, you are too much," those accusations are really coming from someone else's unresolved pain, but it still leaves a mark. It still holds in our bodies. It still holds in our emotions. It still reacts in our nervous system. And the person receiving it may start believing it themselves. They might start believing the story that you're telling them, even if it's not true. Because when we hear it over and over and over again, we continue to create this world of delusion. And in this world of delusion, they're going to believe that you're looking out for them. And that's why they internalize it as something that they're actually doing wrong. This is how projection can become identity damage. But how does projection shape our identity? I think one of the deepest parts of this whole topic is that projection doesn't only affect conflict, it changes self-conception. And what stood out to me in my research is that projection can just distort your identity by pushing these unwanted feelings onto you, which then you absorb the role, making you have these feelings. And over time, you become the selfish one, the angry one, the problem. It's because of these questions that we start internalizing everything. Because with self-identity, people around us help us create our identity. And when people do that, we start to take everything that they say so seriously, and we take it all to heart. And that's what causes so much pain with projection and identity. This is why it feels so real, because people do not only respond to what is true. Sometimes they respond to what they're repeatedly told. And if this happens inside families, romantic relationships, or emotionally intense spaces, it can shape the way the person sees himself. When you start asking yourself the questions, am I difficult? Am I selfish? Am I the problem? Or is this who I really am? This is why projection can be so powerful. It's not just to distort the moment, it distorts the mirror. So when people internalize other people's unresolved pain, it happens through the repeated exposure, the emotional closeness, and the weak emotional boundaries. When someone is constantly on the receiving end of another person's blame, shame, or criticism, or an unprocessed pain, they may begin to absorb it without realizing it, especially if they're empathetic, if they can start carrying their feelings, if they're self-aware, or they're just never fully there to begin with. Because a lot of people are emotionally aware, but we become emotional sponges. They just absorb it, they reflect with it, they carry it, they find meaning in it, and they start to fix a pain that was never theirs. And over time, that can make someone feel responsible, or it just makes the wounds never healable. That is why boundaries are so important when it comes to projection. Without boundaries, someone else's projection can start feeling like your own inner voice. So, how does projection and relationships come together? Projection shows up everywhere, but relationships are where it is the clearest. In my research, I found that in romantic relationships, unconscious feelings connected to a parent can get projected onto a partner. And when the partner starts identifying with and expressing those feelings, projective identification can begin. So, what does this look like? It looks like the same fight over and over again. It feels like the same accusations, the same wounds, and the same confusion. You start to get upset. You can't fully explain what's going on. And then your partner keeps reacting to something that you were never a part of. And it can make the relationship and arguments just feel repetitive. In the repetitiveness, we feel emotionally loaded. And it becomes even harder to untangle when it's a problem that never existed within us to begin. Something else I found is that people can work with this by recognizing the pattern. When you recognize the pattern, you can slow it down. And when you slow it down, you can start to find the meaning behind it. So a great question is, let's go deeper. Let's figure out what the core issue is, because most of the time, it's not your fault. And I think that matters because projection is not only something that we spot in other people. Sometimes it's something to get honest about in ourselves. And one of the biggest things that projection likes to do is it's a huge feeding moment for narcissists. Projection can be a way for narcissistic people to protect their self-image. They may accuse others of being attention-seeking, showy, selfish, or even irresponsible, while avoiding the responsibility and the accountability themselves for the way that they treat other people and the way that they treat themselves internally. And that matters because in narcissistic dynamics, this can just become a cycle. The more shame and the more criticism that gets piled on, the more the person begins to doubt who they really are. And that's what's scary, is that this defense mechanism can not only hurt you, but it could be also something that someone else puts onto you. And that's even harder to deal with because it's not our problem. It's not the problem that existed within us from the beginning. This is why projection can feel so destabilizing in relationships with highly defensive people. It's not just blame, it's erosion. So one of the biggest questions we have to ask, how do we respond to projection? One of the clearest things I found is setting boundaries. Boundaries are the best way to fight projection. Instead of saying, oh, you're to blame, you can say, I disagree, or I don't see it that way. This can help the person who's projecting onto you to not allow them to dive deeper into the issue. It kind of puts a standing point of, hey, I just don't see it that way. When someone is projecting, explaining yourself endlessly, it doesn't help. Sometimes the healthiest move is to stay grounded, to not absorb what they're saying to you, to not take on their feelings as if it is your own pain, to not take on the responsibility that they're throwing at you. And let's say if the person keeps continuing to project, you can't move forward. It's not necessary for you to. That's when you have to find your way out. That's when you have to say, this is not who I am. I'm not this cold. This is just self-protection to protect myself from allowing your defense mechanism to hurt me, to taking your pain and throwing it onto me. And so one of the biggest things people confuse is projection versus false consensus. The thing that confused people the most is that the false consensus effect is the tendency to assume our own attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors are more common and normal than they actually are. I also wrote this distinction this way. Projection equals attributing your own feelings, traits, or impulses to someone else, while false consensus equals assuming other people think like you do. And in social psychology, Ross, Green, and House describe the false consensus effect as an egocentric bias in social perception and attribution processes. Now, I know that phrase seems very confusing in itself, and to basically explain it in the most simplest term is that the false consensus is less about defense and more about assuming your own view is a normal one. This thing in me belongs to you. That's what projection says. While the false consensus says what I think must be what most people think too. They overlap, but they're not the same. I think the biggest takeaway from all of this is that projection is not just about misreading other people. It's about what happens when we cannot yet face something that's within ourselves. And that is why the opening line from my research is so important. Projection often reveals what we have not yet faced in ourselves. Projection may protect us in those moments, but it can also distort our relationships. It can distort conflict. It can distort our identity. It can cause real harm to the people carrying what was never truly theirs. So if I had to leave you with one thought, it would be this. Not every accusation is insight. Not every strong reaction is truth. And not everything thrown at you belongs to you. Sometimes projection is pain looking for somewhere to land. And healing begins when we learn how to recognize it without absorbing it and how to notice it in ourselves without shame. Now, I understand that projection is an unconscious feeling that you may not know that you're doing. But listening to this episode and understanding who you are is the first step forward to healing and to identifying what you're doing. Listen, I have projected a lot before, and it's not something easy that you can just identify. It takes time and it takes practice, like everything, but it begins with you. And if you can make the distinction within yourself, then you're taking the one step forward to becoming the best version of yourself. So don't be scared. You've got this. And if you are projecting, just ask the questions within yourself if you're saying or doing the wrong thing, or if this is unresolved pain within you. I'm always here. I'm always in your corner. Please remember, you're not alone. And I'll catch you on the next episode.